Now, today we are joined by Ms. Lee Greenwood from the Nature Conservancy and the Don't Move Firewood program. Ms. Greenwood will discuss people's knowledge, attitudes, and perceptions of various things related to forest health, invasive species, and human-mediated invasive species movement. This webinar is designed to help woodland owners, foresters, tree care professionals, researchers, natural resource managers, and concerned citizens learn about the impact firewood movement has on non-native pests and how we can use this knowledge to help improve the health of our forests. The title of Ms. Greenwood's webinar is Public Attitudes About Firewood and Forest Pests. And with that, I will turn it over to Ms. Greenwood. Lee?
Thanks, Dave. Can somebody just mention in the chat room if they can hear me? Just put a yes in there. Unfortunately, something's going on. Thank you. Donald says he can hear me, so I'm going to assume everyone else can too. So my name's Lee Greenwood. I'm the Don't Move Firewood Program Manager, as well as the Director of the Firewood Outreach Coordinating Initiative. This presentation is a selected subsample of data that we collected in July and August regarding public attitudes towards firewood, forest pests. We also gathered information on forest fires that I will not be presenting here for time reasons. And then once I go through all of the data that I'm going to be presenting in the first half of the seminar, I will be moving towards messaging suggestions as opposed to just the public attitudes and data from there. So we're going to have two different parts of this webinar. First, a little methodology for anybody who really likes statistics. We did 1,223 telephone interviews with American voters. The reason we have a particular demographic of voters is that is an easy way to sample the American public as a whole. It was conducted in a brief spurt in July and August, and we used a collection via both landline and cell phones, because if you exclude cell phones, you get a very biased sample. Our margin of error is about 4.7, which is pretty high, to be completely frank, and that is because it's incredibly difficult to get the margin of error lower when you're sampling the entire nation. Due to rounding, a lot of my graphs are not going to really add up to 100%. If you ever see one that adds up to something grossly not 100%, please let me know. That might be an error, but if it's off by 2 or 3%, that's probably just rounding. And we have selected comparisons to nationwide surveys that have been conducted in the last 5 years. And those particular surveys, some of them were conducted by my group, some of them were conducted by other nonprofits, and we are able to use parallel questions in order to track longitudinal changes in attitudes and behaviors. So those are really important to note, and you'll be seeing those in some but not all of the slides. Remember, if you have a question for me directly, you can put it in the chat, and at the bottom right-hand side of each slide, there's a number. In the case of this methodology slide, there's a number 6. If you write down that number in your question, i.e. like I have a question about the methodology, parentheses, slide 6, that will really help me appropriately answer the questions at the end of the presentation. So please do that. A quick primer on census divisions. A lot of our data is divided up either by these small census divisions or bigger census divisions. The South division of the census is the 3 pieces that you see here: West, South Central, East, South Central, and South Atlantic. So when I cite the South region, that's what I'm talking about. When I cite smaller regions, please look up your state and write down the name of your smaller region. They're not all necessarily intuitively named. Okay, so we're going to start with a few slides on issue context so you can understand the mental state of the American public in July and August on regards to forest health. So at this time, economic issues were seen as more serious than environmental concerns. And this is something that we see year to year, that when you ask the public about various different things that concern their lives, they're going to list things like healthcare, the economy, etc., way before environmental concerns. But people are very much concerned about things that have to do with American forests. So for instance, if you talk about the environment for air pollution and smog, you have a very large number of people say that is somewhat, very, or extremely serious. And then as soon as you get to the next line, forest fires that burn trees and homes, you see that while the numbers go down, it's still about 50% of the American public consider that something very serious, or somewhat serious, or extremely serious. Likewise, insects that kill trees and diseases that kill trees are definitely something that concerns the American public. So while it doesn't really compete with the economy in terms of where it comes out on the list, these things are concerning to the American public. Contrary to probably the demographic of people that are on this phone call, the American public as a whole actually doesn't do very much out in what we would consider to be a sort of native forest landscape. So things like fishing or going on vacation or hunting. You know, hiking, they definitely do, but what's interesting is that seems to be very regionally oriented. On the bottom right of some of the slides, we have two comparisons between two different groups of data, and that is the state of North Carolina, which is on the left in these comparison slides, versus the nation. The reason for that fairly arbitrary comparison is that we received extra funding to put extra samples in North Carolina from the North Carolina Nature Conservancy. And so I am able to pull out that one state in this one instance and say whether or not it's different when compared to the nation. Now, a great example is that in North Carolina, 10% fewer of members of the public hike than when compared to the nation as a whole. So you can see there's going to be variations. That is one of the only statistically significant differences between North Carolina and the nation, so that's why I've got it highlighted in red. Anthony, yes, I hear that dial tone. If you guys, let's see, I'm going to write a quick note to Dave, because he can't hear me, to please mute the group so that he knows that that's a little bit distracting. All right, we'll just go through them. Now, let's go to information on forest pests, now that we have a couple pieces of orientation data in our heads. So in terms of whether or not the American public even has any concept of forest pests, amazingly, they absolutely say they do, and it holds steady over the course of the last decade. So just a little over half of the American public says, yes, they have some sort of idea of the fact that non-native insects and diseases are infesting and killing trees. And that's good. That means people are actually aware of the issues that we all work on and are concerned about. Southerners, and that's those three small census groups bunched into one larger region so that I can get enough of the sample to actually say something, have heard less in terms of whether or not they've heard a lot. And they've heard less when you look at the total of, yes, I've heard at least something. But it is, relatively speaking, not a huge difference when compared to the nation. So, you know, there's differences between the southern group versus the nation as a whole, but they're not tremendous. There's a little bit of background noise, so let's see if we can fix that. All right, let's go to the next slide. So familiarity with particular pests in general has mostly held steady throughout the last couple of years. So when you look at pests that have the greatest level of awareness by their name recognition, like Dutch elm disease and gypsy moth, you see things going up or down. It's not, generally speaking, particularly statistically significant. You can see that chestnut blight in particular holds really quite steady, which is kind of interesting. But then when you get to pests that have had a tremendous outbreak trajectory during the course of the last decade, you get actually a really different result. And this graph shows the difference in that infestation trajectory in two specific regions that we have enough data to look at. One is the top two bars, which is the southern census region. And you can see that the southern census region in 2010 only had 20% of people saying that they had ever heard of emerald ash borer, whereas that number improved quite a bit to 27% of people in 2016. So the southern region has shown significant improvement. Likewise, when you look at a different region that we have sufficient data to make a generalization about, which is the East North Central Census region, which we have only 3 out of 5 states sampled for in 2005. Unfortunately, that's just how we ran the sample back then. You can see that emerald ash borer goes from a smaller amount of name recognition in 2005 to a high and stable amount of name recognition in 2010 and 2016. This is essentially what you would guess would happen in an area that has now a sustained infestation of emerald ash borer. So the South has a ways to go in terms of both whether or not its states are infested and whether or not outreach has reached people, and that is what is probably leading to the rise in awareness levels. Now, when you talk about these pests, you can also ask people, who would you trust to educate you about forest pests? And we've asked this question year after year after year, and basically we get the same results for the last decade with very minor differences across time. The number one most trusted demographic to give somebody some information about a forest pest or a forest in general is a park ranger, followed immediately by a scientist. A division of forestry, which is probably a lot of you are with a division of forestry or with an agency that has a very similar name. Now remember, the public often doesn't understand very well the divisions between, for instance, U.S. Forest Service state and private forestry versus the state division of forestry. To them, sometimes it's the same. And that's probably one of the things that is reflected in the results of both the Division of Forestry and the Forest Service having the same amount of trust. Possible that people just don't know that they're different. Now, on the bottom of this particular graph, on the bottom right, you can see I've added in those North Carolina comparisons because we do have that extra data available. And you can see that as a case study, North Carolina trusts, in general, conservation organizations less than the nation does. And also, they trust local business owners and timber companies more, by a lot, than the nation does. And that's fascinating because what it does suggest is that when you talk about a trusted authority, there's some pretty distinct differences in the culture of the area, which I think we could all kind of predict might be the case. Here it is in the data. We know that there's differences. However, those top-tier trusted authorities do not show any difference between the North Carolina specific state data and the national data. And I think and that's why, for one thing, I did not actually list additional data, but also that should be something that's consistent nationwide. Okay, so we're going to move into my specialty, which is firewood. Now, it's probably helpful for you all to know that about half of people surveyed in America burn firewood at home in some way, whether in a fireplace or on their back patio in a chimenea or a pit or a smoker or something like that. And about half of the public says they burn in some sort of outdoor recreational capacity, so camping or RVing or fishing or something like that. There is significant overlap of those two groups, so some people that burn at home also burn outdoors. But you can also see that there's differences in the amount and the number of people that use firewood according to location. So, you know, the different categories. The different categories show different distributions slightly. And also the numbers, and you'll notice that the numbers are actually quite a bit different, and that's because when you burn at home, sometimes you burn every single day because you're home heating. So we had to do the categories a little bit differently. Okay. Now when you ask people, have you ever heard of the concept of don't move firewood, the responses are actually incredibly consistent over time. We are not showing either a drop off of the number of people who say they have heard that they shouldn't move firewood, and nor are we seeing an improvement. Which is to say that we are being successful at keeping this with as many people who are willing to pay attention and listen and who we're reaching out to, but we, of course, have plenty of room for improvement. That message where we say that, let me flip back, where we say, for instance, in 2016, 37% of people have in fact seen some sort of information saying they shouldn't move firewood, then breaks out into a pretty wild amount of regional variation. The lowest awareness region of the different census divisions is the mountain region, followed up by west, south, central. But then you get these incredibly well-informed areas, which are essentially the Great Lakes, east, north, central, and west, north, central. That's the 70% and 56% bars there, the third and fourth group. And then New England is catching up really fast, likely because both they have increasing presence, I should say increasing omnipresence of the emerald ash borer, as well as the Asian longhorn beetle infestation in Worcester still trudging on. And so, you know, you're getting these different regional variations according to where the sort of, quote, poster child pests are occurring. Regrettably, the South Atlantic and East, South, Central areas are pretty low in terms of their levels of awareness, but I think part of that is tracking the reality of emerald ash borer's distribution across the United States. So as emerald ash borer, because it's such a prominent issue, moves across that area and establishes in that area for quite some time, we will see the firewood outreach increase, and we will see the number of people that have heard of the problem increase as well. Now, this is a kind of a funny and I guess you would say obvious response of people. If they've heard about the issue of not moving firewood, then they say they're less likely to move firewood. What's important about this is that, somewhat hilariously, with a lot of public education messages, people don't respond that hearing about it makes them more likely to change their behavior. So they'll say like, oh yeah, I've heard of that, I'm definitely not going to do it, which is of course a terrible response, but that's kind of human nature. You're like, I don't care, I'm not going to change my behavior. With the don't move firewood messaging, what we've seen is that we have a much higher than average response of, yeah, I am going to not move firewood as a behavior change than other types of behavior changes. So this is excellent. What it means basically is that we have a chance of changing the human behavior, and it's a higher chance than many other different public education campaigns out there, which is a good thing. So we're really pleased to know, and we've seen this before in prior samples as well, that when people hear they shouldn't move firewood, they internalize, okay, I probably shouldn't move firewood, and that's critical, because otherwise we would just be wasting our breath. Okay, so interestingly, with people consistently saying that they have heard the message, nowadays when we ask the question, how often do you transport firewood, the results are that people are transporting it not super often, so never, that bottom big brown bar. 70% of people say they never move firewood. Now the metric for moving firewood in this particular graph that we give them during the course of the polling process is 50 miles. So if they never move firewood, that means they don't transport it over 50 miles. Likewise, when we ask them, oh, you do transport firewood, okay, how far? Then you can see that on the right. So 50 miles or less, so there's the more or less acceptable distance as designated by the rule of thumb that a lot of different organizations espouse, even though it is a little bit controversial at times. 68% of people adhere to that basic rule of thumb, that firewood should not be moved particularly far. And then there's a bunch of people that are moving it what we would just designate as too far, and that is the 15%, the 9%, 7%, etc. So those are the people we need to work on. So I've given you all this data. I spent, let's see, 23 minutes bringing you some of the public polling information that we've got. What do people do? What do they admit to? How are they willing to change? So now we're going to talk about how we're going to get the people to listen to you all in terms of making sure you've got a message that you think will help reduce the risk of the movement of forest pests throughout or from the Don't Move Firewood campaign or your own needs in your own campaign. The best way to communicate with the public in terms of an actual product is something that we've asked for a few years. And what the public says they're most willing to listen to as a concept is not always exactly what they really do listen to. But this is what they say. They say that they're going to be most interested in learning that they should not be moving firewood particularly far, up to under 50 miles being the rule of thumb, if they're receiving a brochure at a state park. Now remember, we already talked about trusted messengers. They're receiving that brochure from somebody that they perceive as a park ranger. And so it's a trusted messenger and a place where firewood is pertinent. Likewise, a lot of people think that the actual manufacturers of firewood are to be trusted, and so it's quite intuitive then that the public would say, oh, I would trust, or I would be caught in attention by a label on a firewood package. And if you remember a few slides back, I said, you know, what's interesting is in North Carolina specifically, well, because we do have that extra data, we know that people trust timber companies and et cetera more in North Carolina. Well, it turns out that also reflects out here in what they think will attach attention. So in North Carolina, 87%, which is 10% more than the nation, people think that they will trust the, they will catch the attention of a label on a firewood package. So there's a difference there depending on the regional trust levels and the regional sort of specificity of the culture in the area. Every time we run something about what's going to catch your attention, you always get information from a friend or neighbor because, of course, we always talk to our friends and our neighbors, and that's going to get our attention, and that's great that we see that in all of our surveys. So keep in mind, too, some of these slides are really complicated. You know, this is a lot of data, and this presentation is going to be recorded. So, you know, if I skip over a particular line here that you're really interested in, either ask a question or you can come back and look at it later. When we get down into the slightly less attention-grabbing items, we do run into some interesting phenomena, which is that digital media in general is trusted more by younger people, and physical paper media, so newspapers, quite literally, is trusted more by older demographics. And we have that data broken out, and that's the easiest way to sum it up. And what ends up happening, because those two demographics, you know, are balanced in our survey, is that drives some of the digital media and the paper media down the list of what's going to capture attention, because essentially they're evening each other out. So if we redid all these this last slide and this slide according to all young people, so folks from, say, 18 to 34, I think is one of our major brackets, we would get a really different distribution than if we did it all 55 plus. And that's important because if you know your age distribution of people that you feel like you need to reach, so for instance, if you work with county extension and you know that your county is very heavy on retirees, and so it's important to make sure you're reaching retirees, then this sort of information could be really helpful to have broken out by that age group, because it does vary tremendously. And I think everybody probably could guess that if they thought about it. You know, we all receive information differently according to our ages just because of the media environment we're in. We also see, again, that there is variation in my North Carolina versus USA subsample. So Facebook, for instance, being less attention-grabbing in North Carolina by quite a bit, and a poster at a firewood point of sale being also less trusted, which is sort of fascinating in this case because North Carolina shows other inclinations of trusting points of sale higher. So some variation that's maybe a little bit difficult to explain in that one. So a question that comes up all the time, because the name Don't Move Firewood implies that you shouldn't be moving firewood, which is grossly oversimplifying the problem. Is this really an effective slogan? Because it's not like we can't move firewood from the back of our property to the front. And it even isn't as if we can't move firewood in some sort of industrial fashion from a cutting unit to a yard. That's not what we're getting at. So is this effective? Well, we decided that we would do our very best to really gather some scientific information as to whether or not when you tell people don't move firewood, they think it's effective. And I made a mistake the first time I did this. And I accidentally split the vote. And this is kind of fascinating, and we're going to just set aside all the political aspects that come in here because it's kind of funny at the same time. But when you ask professionals in the field of forest health which of these three slogans is most effective, they're going to say don't move firewood. 50% roughly of them are going to say don't move firewood is the most effective is the most effective slogan, excuse me. And, you know, as the campaign manager of a campaign named Don't Move Firewood, I found that very satisfying. And then I realized that I had done it all wrong, that we were splitting the vote and we were only asking the choir. And this is a terrible methodology. It leads to inaccurate results. So instead of doing this again, we did it right. So when you vote in a strict what's called A/B sample, so first we tested only buy it where you burn it against don't move firewood, and then randomly on a separate sample of people we tested don't move firewood against buy local, burn local, you get a completely and utterly different result. And that's important because it shows that sample type matters and methodology matters. And what you find is that the positive action-oriented messages blow don't move firewood out of the water in terms of what the public themselves thinks is going to be most effective. Now, buy it where you burn it is a message that's been used across the United States for quite a few years, so it does have a slightly better result than buy local, burn local, which is largely only used in Vermont, Canada, and a few other sort of odd little places. So there isn't basically a difference between buy it where you burn it or buy local, burn local. What's important to note is that the sort of omnipresence of buy it where you burn it simply suggests that it's already out there, and to remain consistent professionally, we should probably stick to it. So there's no real difference in what the public thinks is most effective, but there is a definite difference in which one already is out there and already is well recognized. So a lot of people then say, so Lee, are you going to change the name of your campaign? Well, no, frankly. But what we are going to do is use this data to inform our outreach approach. Don't move firewood is still the most applicable message in some situations. And when we're redoing all of our posters, postcards, brochures, billboards, everything for 2017, which is a process we're going in right now, what we're going to be doing is making sure that buy it where you burn it headlines every piece of that outreach material as much as possible in any place where that is the preferred slogan by the local professionals, and that's most states. It's important to note that in some places the message to buy it where you burn it is not acceptable because there's a very heavy component of people that gather their own firewood, and you don't want to alienate them. And so then we use different slogans and different approaches, and I think that's a really valid concern. So in general, when you want to make sure that you're getting your message across, there's a few things that I wanted you guys to just take home as a message basic from this particular webinar. And number one is never stop. We saw in one of the first slides that the amount of awareness as to the message, don't move firewood, and that question was something like, have you ever heard about the need to not transport firewood long distances? It's held steady for a decade, and that is because of the combined efforts of hundreds of forest health professionals to make sure that this is something that people know. If we had all just said, oh, we've reached 40% of the American public in 2005, good job, everybody, and then walked away from it, we would not have seen that sustained level through the years. So we have to keep this up. We have to keep pushing it. The other thing that I think is really important to take home is that the most effective place to reach people, and this is both seen on the slides and is something that you could easily conceptualize, is that when the message is going to make sense to them is when you should reach people. So the message to not move firewood isn't going to make nearly as much sense just on a random billboard in the random middle of nowhere. But it might make a lot of sense as you're arriving at a park, so in a community that rings a park. As you're interacting with a park ranger who is a trusted messenger. As you're receiving your email that confirms your campsite. That's one of our #1 approaches that we use, because then people haven't even figured out where they're going to buy firewood yet, and then they're getting that message right at that moment where they might make the right decision for the situation. Then the other place where we think that reaching them makes the most sense is at that point of sale, and I talked about that in several other slides. When they're making that decision, that's a place where they're going to be receptive to a message about firewood. Then the other thing that I think, we need to take as a critical messaging basic when we talk to the public about firewood issues is that you need to tell them what to do, not just what not to do. And that's part of why people criticize the message, don't move firewood, because it doesn't tell you what to do. That is the appropriate action to take, and people want to know what to do. Buy it where you burn it is a what to do in some, but not every situation. And so whenever that is appropriate, that is the official message that we espouse. And in locations where for whatever reason that's not socially savvy or it's not realistic according to the timber industry or whatever, we tailor the message to be a what to do that is a different what to do, to make sure that we don't alienate people or even just tell them something that doesn't make any sense at all for their situation. All right, so those are the messaging basics themselves, but then let's talk about the biggest take-homes from the presentation so that we can kind of figure out where do we go from here. This is the Southern Forest Group, and so I thought I would make sure to highlight that the southern states are a little bit less aware about forest pests than the rest of the nation, but it's showing significant growth since 2010, and I think that there is a tremendous amount of potential to have people reaching out throughout the southern region and really boosting that. And when the southern region reaches more people, the entire nation as a whole is going to have greater awareness, of course, because of populations and so forth. So I think that's a really great area for growth, and I'm particularly glad to be giving this presentation to that demographic and everybody else who's joining us from another region, of course. I know that you're probably laughing when I say that sometimes we hear messages and we just ignore them, and that's a major problem. It is, my second bullet point here is really critical. When you tell people that moving firewood is bad because it transports insects and diseases between places, they actually are more likely to not move firewood in the future. So they internalize that message, and it's a higher level of internalization than a lot of other messages. And so you can go home knowing that when you talk to somebody about this, people are actually listening, which is fantastic. And we know that they're listening partially because when we ask them, are you moving firewood and how far are you moving it, it is clearly working. We are seeing with human behavior change, people transport firewood shorter distances and less frequently the more we tell them about the problem. And this is shown in our data. It's shown in other data, like the data that Andrea Distorrent has on her region in Wisconsin. And it's shown in other places as well. So the more we tell people, the better their behavior gets from the perspective of forest health. Okay, another take-home message that I just covered, so I'm sure it's a little repetitive, is that the most effective times and places to remind the public are when they're already thinking about firewood or the act of traveling. And so if you have a moment to reach them, those are the types of moments that you should be picking out. the buy it where you burn it slogan is more effective, according to the opinion of the public, than just giving them don't move firewood. And so when that works, I highly recommend you headline your outreach items with it. And then last but not least, I end on a hopeful note. Don't stop now. We're all getting better at this. We are all teaching the public on a daily basis about important behaviors, and it is fairly clear from some of the samples that we're seeing in different parts of the United States, which I didn't include partially just for time, that when we let up a bit on outreach, awareness declines. And this is completely intuitive. You don't see Coca-Cola not putting up billboards because we've all learned the name of their drink. You know, you don't see people not putting up signs not to litter, keep America beautiful, just because we've all learned not to litter. You have to keep up on outreach. Otherwise, the awareness and the behaviors that you want will decline over time. Things simply drop out of the level of relevance and the level of front-of-mind action. So don't stop. And that's just kind of a little bit of a motivational speech for you all. Thank you for having me. And I did want to say we have 20 minutes for questions. And I did see a bunch of questions buzzing by. And remember, I'm happy to answer them. So, Dave, I just saw that maybe you can hear me now. Is that accurate?
Lee, I can hear you. Can
Are
you
you
hear
on
me?
mute?
Okay.
I can hear you, but you're a little faint, and that is
Yes,
fine.
I do.
So do you
Yes, I
wanna
do. Good
start
job.
the
I could hear you the whole way
question
through, so apologies, everyone, for the mix-up there. But let's start with some of the questions. We had several dealing with some of the data and some of the statistics. So let's go to your slide number 19, Lee, and I'll let you drive to get back there. Yeah, I believe that's it. Right? So the first question or comment was they didn't see any significant difference between the two groups. Is that accurate, or were there statistics run? Can you maybe talk about that a little bit?
Oh, well, first of all, unfortunately, because of historical reasons with our data collection since 2005, the groups themselves are different, which is kind of a nightmare. But once we started doing it this way, it would have made it non-comparable longitudinally if we had changed the groups. So you can see, for instance, that burn at home is 11 to 30, but then burn outdoors is 10 more, et cetera. And I mentioned that because there's a home heating component that screws up the way that we collect data. But we're not trying to necessarily compare the number and distribution of people that burn firewood at home versus burn firewood in an outdoors recreational setting, because actually the difference between the two actually doesn't matter in any substantive way. What we're trying to get a grip on is who's doing what for messaging purposes in the future. And then we do have we have the ability to cross-tab the data and see where the overlaps are, and a lot of people both burn at home and burn outdoors. And somebody, Chris Wyatt, is saying that you would choose to have two different slides. I hear you. That's a constant problem with a presentation that's complicated and statistically challenging, is whether or not things should look comparative or be more compact in the situation of a PowerPoint. It's a tough call.
Right, and there was
a
couple other questions about the distribution of the data. May or may not be relevant because of how the data were collected. But one quick question, easy one: is it possible to get a copy of the questionnaire that was used? Yes, absolutely. I'd be willing to send you a
tell you what
of that if that's important. If you send that to me, Lee, I will put it up on the main page folks went to for this webinar. And if you go down below the picture, there's a couple related areas that say related URLs and related files. One of the files is the PDF of your slides, and I can put the questionnaire itself as a second related file. I'll call it a Greenwood Firewood questionnaire, something to that effect.
Okay, great. So, Dave, too, some people can't hear you very well. So the question was, can we get copies of the questionnaire that was actually used to generate all of this data? And my answer was yes. And Dave just expounded on that we'll have it in the supporting data files on the web page. And then also, yes, Rob Trickle mentions that typically at the bottom of each slide we have the exact question labeled out, although I have to admit not every single slide has that for various reasons. So you can see these are questions 14 and 15, for instance,
right
at the very bottom in tiny font. I'm sorry if it's difficult to read. But, Dave, what's the next question, or does anybody have a follow-up on that one?
The next question is, there's a couple that were somewhat similar. How do you expect people to get firewood to their place of use? And we touched on the fact that there's not a big difference between moving firewood, say, from your backyard to the front yard. But then the question of what is a long distance? What type of firewood movement specifically are we trying to limit? I had a couple questions on that. Could you talk about that a little bit, Lee?
Yeah. Okay. I would love to, because this is one of the biggest questions that I received. And the question, to repeat it, was, how do we expect people to use firewood at all if we're telling them not to transport it? And what is the real, what are we really getting at here? And I think it really gets to the core of human transport of invasive species as opposed to the natural, unavoidable spread on their own wings and legs and wind. And at its core, what Don't Move Firewood as a concept is trying to do is decrease the volume of invasive species movement from place to place over large jumps that would take a very long time for an invasive species to do by itself. So when we say don't move firewood, we're not saying, don't harvest firewood and then bring it to sale. And we're not saying don't buy firewood and then drive with it. All of these things would be utterly ridiculous to say, useless, alienating, you name it. What we're really trying to get at, and what our deeper outreach materials that we provide to the public say, is, for instance, as the rule of thumb, try to not move it farther than 50 miles or buy it within 50 miles of your final destination. Whenever it's feasible, buy heat-treated firewood, because heat-treated firewood, especially that with a state or federal seal, has been heated to the point where pests are essentially either dead or non-viable within it. And so it presents no risk of movement as long as it's properly treated. Now the next question that almost inevitably comes up is, what about timber sales? What about logs? And timber sales and logs are part of a larger industry that has chain of custody and, Department of Agriculture or Department of Forestry oversight. So it's a really different issue than the public movement of both commercial and private firewood. Firewood itself is often sold by independent operators on the side of the road with zero oversight. And that really leads to a lot of lack of awareness, both by the public and the seller, as well as unintentional violations of federal and state laws. And that's one of the reasons that we have the Don't Move Firewood campaign, is just to try to even out the awareness landscape so that people aren't moving firewood hundreds of miles. They're moving firewood the minimum viable distance for their commercial needs.
What were the laws being violated in those cases?
That is a great question. The laws are extremely different according to where you are. There are some states right now with no laws. There are some states, as somebody just typed up in Connecticut, there are incredibly specific laws depending on where you are in the state and what type of firewood you may or may not be moving. There are entire regions of the United States where it is illegal to leave that region and move to a new region with untreated firewood. That would be the emerald ash borer and the gypsy moth quarantine areas. A little known fact, for instance, that a lot of folks on this phone may not be aware of is that if you live in an imported fire ant quarantined area and you store firewood on the ground, it would be illegal to transport that firewood out of the imported fire ant region. So if you drove straight north, essentially, until you left the fire ant area, you would have violated a federal quarantine on that firewood as a regulated item for imported fire ants. So just because these laws seem arbitrary doesn't mean they are, and doesn't mean they don't exist. You know, they're very important, and you set yourself up for both ecological damage and potential legal ramifications by violating them. Now, as the leader of the Don't Move Firewood campaign, this is not how I, start off the conversation with, you're violating a federal law. That's a great way to get people very angry and defensive. So that's not where we go. But the reality is
right.
that
So
sometimes
to that end, Lee, we've got a couple of questions on different tactics used and that are out there. Any particular tactics for communicating with people who don't buy firewood but harvest, transport, and burn it for their own personal use?
Yeah, so when people are harvesting and transporting it for personal use, I think the thing that resonates with them the most is one of the lines that we often use, which is don't bring pests to your favorite places. So if you're harvesting firewood and then bringing it to your family cabin that's been in your family for generations, the motivation to keep the trees around that family cabin healthy should be very high. No one wants to destroy an area by moving pests into it unintentionally. And so that sort of sentimental approach of, you have this emotional investment in this area, don't ruin it with your own actions, whether accidental or not, I think is really where I would say go.
Andrea Distorrance just said basically the same thing, is emphasize that by moving potentially infested firewood, you may be bringing pests directly to your property. So that is a good one. She is. So a question I had was,
Andrea's on it.
Urban versus rural messaging. And I'm thinking about down here in the southeast, as Emerald Ash Borer moves in, we've got a lot of people that are very rural that may use firewood for their own means only, or may sell it maybe near campgrounds. And then you've got a whole almost separate demographic that lives in the big cities that flocks to these campgrounds on the weekend. Are there different message strategies you could or should use for these groups? And that gets to kind of my bigger question. We've got a lot of people from different walks of life on these webinars. We've got consulting foresters, state and extension folks, all sorts of different groups. What can folks in those different job areas do to try to help keep our forests healthy and help reduce the spread of pests from humans? That's a huge question. Go.
That is a huge question. So the first half of the question was, what about urban versus rural resident messaging? And, I tried to highlight on the slides a little bit how we do have this separate information for North Carolina versus the United States, because it shows that while we can make some generalizations, and there's no differences between these two choice groups that we looked at, actually sometimes there's really big differences in what resonates with them. And I think that applies the same for urban versus rural residents. You need to know your audience and what resonates with them and what behaviors they have, and take those and think about whether or not you are actually giving them a message that they can listen to. We talked about that earlier in terms of, when you say something, do they do it? And we know that, yes, generally speaking, they do, but when you talk to an urban person about gathering firewood, they're going to be like, gathering firewood? No, I buy firewood. And then in reverse, rural residents are probably going to do the opposite. They'd be like, why would I buy firewood? I can just cut it off the back lot. That's a real difficulty, and I mean, there's no right answer to that, but just knowing who you're talking to, making sure you are reaching them in a place where they're willing to listen, and you're giving them a suggestion that even just makes any sense to them whatsoever. In terms of what people can do in order to get these messages out, which I think was Dave's core second giant question, repetition is not a bad thing. Participating in a professional webinar like this is excellent because what it does is it gives you an awareness of the different resources available to you. You know, some of the folks on this webinar probably weren't aware that the Don't Move Firewood campaign existed, let alone, you know, has a huge set of resources. Now you know. And now what you can do is go to your own professional networks and say, hey, you know, these posters are available, these brochures are available. This wording is available for our next newsletter, for instance. So there's all sorts of different things available to you when you wish to engage in this type of outreach. And making sure that you support your colleagues in this type of outreach so that we don't, you know, stop giving this outreach out over long periods of time. Because like we talked about, you have to keep going if you would like to continue having people be aware. You have to keep saying the messages. You have to keep pushing them out. And yes, they can get a little bit repetitive, and I just saw somebody from Ohio saying, what do you do when you have to keep telling people over and over and over again? And, you know, changing the message over time to be more relevant, more localized, there's nothing wrong with kind of keeping it fresh. But yeah, it's hard. You know, Don't Move Firewood itself has been around for almost pushing 10 years now, and sometimes it feels like we're saying the same thing over and over again. But, you know, the public doesn't perceive it that much like that because, you know, they're not paying attention for all 10 years in a row. So just doing your best to keep things fresh and you know, releasing new information as it becomes available, I think is really helpful. And Dave, we're losing people because we got 5 minutes on the hour. Do you have any final announcements you're going to need to make or a final question?
I sure don't. I'm going to do, I think that's a great job, Lee. There is another webinar coming up. I am going to push out the CEU link in the chat box. Whoops, that's not it. And then unless anyone has anything else, let's see, copy. Paste. There's that, and then we will. That's for people that need to go right now in your chat box. There's the web redirect link for your CEU stuff. You can always email Lee with questions. Her email is on the webinar itself. This webinar will be available online in probably about a week after we get everything put together. Email me with any questions if you'd like. I want to thank Lee for a great talk. And unless there's any other big questions, big issues, we're probably going to wrap it up here, and I'll push out the redirect link. Lee, did you want to say anything else?
Thank you. And the person who just asked, is there a source for outreach materials for the preferred slogans? So the Don't Move Firewood website resources section is not working properly right now because of a major glitch. So if you'd like to email me, I can send you all sorts of things personally, unfortunately. But thank you, everyone.
Right, and
we're getting our website
another website. If you're in the Northeast, there's nhbugs.org, /Firewood for campers. So there's lots of great resources. If anyone would like me to post some of these resources on the web page, I'd be happy to do that. Feel free to email me directly. And thank you, everyone, for coming, and we'll get going with the CEU thing now. And yes, this is recorded to listen to again. You can go to the same website to find it. Like I said, in about a week, the button that you had today that said, you know, register will turn into a button that says view, and it kind of does the same thing. So these will all be recorded for posterity. So